So, hello everybody. Today I am going to be diving into Anne Bronte's Gothic, or making the case for the Gothic in Anne Bronte to some extent. And I've called this talk The Horror of Hope and the Darkness of the Everyday, because these are some of the themes that I'm going to be pulling out of Anne. But they're not the only themes. We're also going to be looking at Anne within the context of the women's Gothic, the political Gothic, and sort of interrogating different aspects of Anne's work as well. I've used this picture at the beginning because it's a picture of seaside Scarborough about the time that Anne would have travelled there. And it's just a sort of brief introduction to Anne and Anne's life and also her death, because Anne loved going to the seaside. She first went to Scarborough with a family that she was governessing at. She loved it so much that she always sort of wanted to return, and it is ultimately where she died, or where she went to die effectively. She was very ill, hoping that the sea air could cure her, but she basically died on the first day of the holiday, as she was there accompanied by Charlotte and her friend Ellen Nussey. So an image that introduces us a little bit to Anne in some ways. Now, I mentioned that I'm going to be introducing some aspects of Anne for those who don't know as much about her. So my apologies if you are an Anne expert already and you already know all of these facts, but just a little bit of a summary. It's quite important to understand Anne's life because it is some of the sort of foundation and food for some of her work. So it can be really helpful and illuminating. She was born in 1820, the youngest of the Bronte siblings. In 1834, we have the first diary paper. Now, if you're wondering what those are, Emily and Anne, who were very close to each other, wrote these diary papers beginning together every 3 and then every 4 years. So in 1834, 37, 41, and 45. And there was never a last one because both sisters died in 1848, 1849. But these papers were just a kind of insight into the daily life of the two sisters. As I said, the first two papers they wrote together when they were both in the same place. In 1841 and 1845, they were separated. So we get two different views of two different lives, but also a very clear view of their still being in contact, still being very close to each other. And we will be having a look at a couple of these diary papers to see Anne and her life in her own words in a moment. Anne was at home until 1835, where she joined Charlotte at Roe Head School. So Anne joined as a pupil. She wasn't there for very long. She left eventually because of illness in 1837. It was during this period that we have some of her first extant poetry. So it's not necessarily her first poems, but we have the verses by Lady Geralda from 1836, which were written on a visit home. And they are from the world of Gondal, this imaginary world that she created with Emily, her older sister. And I will go into Gondal a little bit more for those of you who aren't familiar with it in a second. In 1839, Anne leaves for the first time as a governess to be with the Inghams of Mirfield, and she doesn't stay there for very long, but she is, of all the sisters, the one who stays away from home the longest in the end, believing it her duty to do so, even though she was really unhappy a lot of the time in her positions. So from 1840 to 1845, she was a governess to the Robinsons at Thorpe Green. And she resigned from there in 1845, 1 month before Bramwell was dismissed. And I'll go into what happened with Bramwell in a second. With them, she visited Scarborough. So that's where that love of Scarborough and the seaside comes in. Now, she helped Bramwell to get a job with the Robinsons in 1843, but his time there ended in scandal. He was a tutor, and there was an affair with the married wife of the family. And it was after this that Bramwell kind of went home and didn't really then go back out into work and the world, and where his struggles with alcoholism really took over. Anne does come home as well in 1845, and she and her sisters collaborate on a literary or publishing project. So the story goes that Charlotte finds some of Emily's verses that Emily has not been showing to her, and is like, these need to be published. And the three of them, under the pseudonyms Curate Ellis and Acton Bell, publish a book of collected poems. Now, Anne's poems are rarely talked about in contrast to Emily's, for example. And this all starts with, back at the time as well, Charlotte is very dismissive of Anne's poetry. When she writes about Emily, she's like, Emily is a genius, her poetry is wild and beautiful. And also Anne was here. But I do recommend reading the Anne Brontë poetry. There is some beauty to it. And as we discovered yesterday, a lot of it is very moving. Now, all three sisters then tried to publish a novel, and actually Emily and Anne's books, Agnes Grey and Wuthering Heights respectively, were the first ones to be picked up by a publisher, Thomas Newby, although Charlotte's was the first to actually be published. So Agnes Grey was published in 1847, and then the book that's perhaps most famous by Anne, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, was published in 1848. She didn't publish again, but she did go on a visit to London with Charlotte because there was this rumor that all of the Bell brothers, in inverted commas, were one person. And so Anne and Charlotte go to London to dispel this with the publisher. Emily does not accompany them. In 1849, Anne dies. In 1848, Bramwell and Emily have both died. In 1849, Anne is ill with consumption. She goes to Scarborough, as I've mentioned, accompanied by Charlotte and Ellen. And that is the end of Anne's story. And she's actually buried in Scarborough. So that's a little brief introduction to Anne. But who was she? What was she like? What do we know about her? We've got various accounts of Anne from different places that give us an insight into who she was, what she was like. These include statements by family friends, including Charlotte's friend Ellen Nussey, who also became Anne's friend. She tells us that Emily and Anne were like twins, inseparable companions, and in the very closest sympathy, which never had any interruptions. So Ellen Nussey is writing here a period when Anne and Emily are at home together. Anne, dear, gentle Anne, was quite different in appearance from the others. She was her aunt's favourite. Her hair was a very pretty light brown and fell on her neck in graceful curls. She had lovely violet blue eyes, fine penciled eyebrows, and clear, almost transparent complexion. She still pursued her studies, and especially her sewing, under the surveillance of her aunt. So you have an idea here of Anne as quite a diligent young woman. But also with this connection to the natural world that all the Bronte sisters said, although perhaps not the same wild world that appears in Emily's novels and in her poetry. You'll note if you read Anne's poetry, there's a lot more about the sort of the simple flowers around the house, which were kind of Anne's delight. In fine and suitable weather, delightful rambles were made over the moors and down into the glens and ravines that here and there broke the monotony of moorland. The rugged bank and rippling brook were treasures of delight. Emily, Anne, and Bramwell used to ford the streams and sometimes place stepping stones for the other two. There was always a lingering delight in these spots. So this same shared love of the moorland landscapes of Yorkshire. We also have this interesting little detail. A little later on, there was the addition of a piano. Anne played also. Basically means saying Emily played beautifully, Anne played also. But she preferred soft harmonies and vocal music. She sang a little. Her voice was weak, but very sweet in tone. So these are from Ellen Nussey's reminiscences on the life of Charlotte, but she also includes Anne in these reminiscences. I also just wanted to include this because I know that a lot of Romancing the Gothic people are cat people. So here are some of the animals that the Bronte sisters shared. Animals were important to the family and were a marker, as you'll see at the end, when used in relation to characters. So I'll go back into that in a second. The picture was by Bramwell, and so it's one of the cats that probably lived with them. So Ellen says, later on, there were 3 household pets. The tawny, strong-limbed keeper, Emily's favourite dog. He was so completely under her control, she could quite easily make him spring and roar like a lion. She taught him this kind of occasional play without any coercion. Flossie, long, silky-eared, black and white Flossie was Anne's favourite, and Black Tom the tabby was everybody's favourite. It received such gentle treatment, it seemed to have lost cat's nature and subsided into luxurious amiability and contentment. The Brontes' love of dumb creatures made them very sensitive of the treatment bestowed upon them. For anyone to offend in this respect was with them an infallible bad sign and a blot on the disposition. This is the idea of animals and the relationship with animals as a marker of character in their novels. And if you think about The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, for example, cruelty to animals is one of the markers that gives us insight very early on into into Arthur's bad character. Don't worry if you've not read Tenant, I will go over some of the plot later. We also have some idea of Anne in her own words from the diary papers and also from letters, of course. One second. So this is a diary paper from 1841. This is the first that she wrote completely independently. And she tells us it's Emily's birthday today. She's now completed her 23rd year and is, I believe, at home. Charlotte is a governess in the family of Mr. White, Bramwell is a clerk in the railway station at London Foot, and I am a governess in the family of Mr. Robinson. I dislike this situation and wish to change it for another. I'm now at Scarborough, my pupils are gone to bed, and I am hastening to write this before I follow them. So we get a bit of a snapshot of the family here as well, but also an idea of Anne in a situation as a governess that she is not enjoying, not because of the job necessarily, because of the situation specifically. This is at the period where the sisters were thinking of setting up their own school, and Anne tells us about that dream, if you will. We're thinking of setting up a school of our own, but nothing definite is settled about it yet. We are now all separate and not likely to meet again for many a weary week, but we are none of us ill that I know of, and are all doing something for our own livelihood, except Emily, who, however, is as busy as any of us, and in reality earns her food and raiment as much as we do. Emily was at home running the household. We've got Keeper, got a sweet little cat and lost it, and also got a hawk, got a wild goose which has flown away, and 3 tame ones, one of which has been killed. I wonder whether the Gondal will still be flourishing and what will be their condition. I'm now engaged writing the 4th volume of Sir Fowler Vernon's life. I left that bit on at the end for you to see how this word of Gondal that she created with Emily forms part of these diary papers as a sort of, it's almost interwoven with the rest of her life. And here she's speculating about whether they will be continuing to write Gondal, whether that world will continue. It does. We also have this excerpt from the 1844 paper. The image, though, is from the 1834. So this is what the very first diary paper looked like when the girls were much younger. From the 1844 paper, she writes, how many things have happened since it was written, some pleasant and some far otherwise. She's mostly there referring to the scandal that happened at Thorpe Green with Bramwell. Yet I was then at Thorpe Green, and now I am only just escaped from it. I was wishing to leave it then, and if I had known that I had 4 years longer to stay, how wretched I should have been. But during my stay, I've had some very unpleasant and undreamt of experience of human nature. Others have seen more changes. Bramwell has left London Foot and been a tutor at Thorpe Green and had much tribulation and ill health. We hope he will be better and do better in the future. And that phrase, do be better and do better, is also used by Emily. I'll go into what Bramwell's situation was, and particularly when Anne was writing Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which was very much influenced by her experiences with Bramwell and his alcoholism, his illness, and his final decline. But we've seen a little bit of Anne's character, a little bit of Anne's life. Let's get on to her work. Now, in the interests of kind of cutting it down, I am only going to look at Anne's poetry and the Tenant of Wildfell Hall. But also, Agnes Grey is the least Gothic, arguably, of her works. I'm not going to argue that it doesn't have Gothic elements, but I'm going to concentrate on these more overtly Gothic texts. And you might be thinking, Sam, these are not Gothic works. Well, hopefully, I will be able to convince you if you're not already convinced as we go along. But before I get into a discussion of actual poetry, I want to first introduce you to the world of Gondal, which is the paracosmic kind of imaginary world which Emily and Anne created together. As you probably will know, and as we discussed in last week's talks, the Bronte siblings together created more than one imaginary world. The first world, called Glasstown, the Vodopolis, then Angria, was ruled primarily by Charlotte and Bramwell, although Emily and Anne had their own lands and their own characters, but they eventually split off from that world and created their own of Gondal. Whereas Charlotte and Bramwell particularly Charlotte, allowed Angria to disappear from their writing to some extent, and Charlotte deliberately turned away from Angria, Emily and Anne continued to write in the Gondal world all through their lives. We don't have much information about it, though, because most of these works, and there's some really interesting hints about how very much there was written about this world, but most of it is lost. We have evidence in the diary papers of some of the story elements, and we have some poetry which we know belong to the Gondal worlds. But how these poems connect together, how they connect to the overarching storylines, is largely a matter of conjecture. And if you look at scholarly opinions on the question, people disagree with each other. But What can we know about Gondal, and does this kind of help us introduce us to a more Gothic Anne? I would argue that it does, but let's have a look. So the first mention of Gondal at all is from the diary paper of 1834, where we get this simple, brief line. It's just wound in among the everyday details of the Brontes' lives. The Gondals are discovering the interior of Galdine, and that's all we know from that first diary paper. In 1837, we have a little bit more detail, and it paints this picture of Emily and Anne creating together. Anne and I are writing in the drawing room, and a poem, and I, Augusta Almeida's life. So one of the characters. Probably Emily writing this, also gives us some extra details of the world and what's going on in it. The emperors and empresses of Gondal and Galdine preparing to depart from Galdine to Gondal to prepare for the coronation, which will be on the 12th of July. It's an overlap here, and they're drawing from real life events as well. And they mention sort of the coronation of Victoria, I think. So they also mention Northumberland in Monkey's Island, Zamora at Evesham, and Northumberland and Zamora are characters from Angria, so we're still seeing that connection there. In 1841, Emily and Anne write separate diary papers because they're separate, but both of them continue to mention Gondal, showing us that they're continuing to write it, with differing levels perhaps of engagement. Emily's very straightforwardly is engaged, telling the story of Gondal as she has done previously, as though it's kind of just a part of everyday life. The Gondolians are at present in a threatening state, but there is no open rupture as yet. All the princes and princesses of the royalties are at the Palace of Instruction. The Palace of Instruction wasn't, by all accounts, a place of education, but one of correction. Anne's diary paper, in contrast, is a little bit more equivocal. I wonder whether the Gondolian will still be flourishing, and what will be their condition. I'm now engaged in writing the 4th volume of Sir Vernon's life. So she's engaged in writing at the moment, but she doesn't know what the future of the world will be. In 1845, both sisters give us much more detail than they have previously given us. But it's still not much. It's more tantalizing than anything else. As you can see from Emily's diary papers, we get a list of characters, although we don't know how they connect together very much, and there's not a clear idea of the storyline. We're told that the characters named are escaping from the palaces of instruction to join the royalists, who are hard driven at present by the victorious republicans. The Gondals still flourish bright as ever. I am at present writing a work on the First Wars. Anne has been writing some articles on this and a book by Henry Sophona. We intend sticking firm by the rascals as long as they delight us, which I am glad to say they do at present. So there's definitely an insight here into the complicated politics that are being explored in this world. Also, it's interesting that it notes that Anne is writing some articles and a book by Henry Sophona. So it looks like Anne is taking on literary pseudonyms within the fictional world, as Charlotte had done extensively in Angria. This last diary paper is Anne's diary paper. And again, we get some tantalizing glimpses of the political state of the world as it existed. She says, I was writing the 4th volume of Sophalal, but during my stay, I've had some very unpleasant and objective experience of human nature. That's the experience at Thorpe Green that we already mentioned. Emily is engaged in writing the Emperor Julius's life. She's read some of it, and I want very much to hear the rest. She's writing some poetry too, and I wonder what it is about. I have begun the 3rd volume of passages in the life of an individual. Now, this is interesting because it shows that they're still communicating about the world of Gondal, but it also shows Emily's withdrawal in terms of the poetry. And it points towards a sort of further isolation of Anne in some ways. And we'll see in her poetry often there is this sense of separation and loneliness that seeps into a lot of her poetry. She goes on to say, we have not yet finished our Gondal chronicles that we began 3 years and a half ago. When will they be done? The Gondals are at present in a sad state. The Republicans are uppermost, but the Royalists are not quite overcome. The young sovereigns with their brothers and sisters are still at the Palace of Instruction, giving us a little bit more detail about what those names were. And the unique societies above half a year ago were wrecked on a desert island as they were returning from Galdine. They're still there, but we have not played at them much yet. The Gondals in general are not yet in first-rate playing condition. Will they improve? So we get an idea of the Gondolian world as one that is full potentially of adventure, politics, and intrigue. But it's not, as Angria was, this very supernatural world. So Glasstown, Vodopolis, and Angria, at the beginning at least, were highly supernatural and very clearly influenced by the 1001 Nights, but also by kind of horror Gothic and Gothic writing. We have resurrections, we have genies, we have murder in the street, we have torture, we have villains. It's a very Gothic register. And Gondal isn't as obviously Gothic, but I will argue that it is quite a Gothic world. It's just we have to move away from a monolithic understanding of the Gothic. Anne's Gothic is non-ghostly and undemonic. So there are a couple of different reasons for this. As I mentioned, Anne's Gothic is not ghostly. There are no ghosts in Anne's work. It's more prosaically realist than that of either of her sisters. I'm not saying that dismissively, though. And there are many reasons for the kind of lack of ghosts. One of them, I think, is Anne's theology does not include ghosts. And this would be quite a common theological standpoint at the time, certainly not universal, but common enough. The idea that ghosts cannot return because they are either because people sleep between the time of death and that of judgment, or because there is a barrier between the living and the dead and between the physical and the spiritual realms. In one of her poems, Severed and Gone So Many Years from 1847, Anne aligns herself with this kind of theological outlook on the ghost. She says in the poem, that somebody has died and she has longed, she has prayed for them to return. False hope, vain prayer, it might not be that thou shouldst visit earth again. I called on heaven, I called on thee, and watched and waited, all in vain. I think what's really interesting about this poem is it isn't the Gothic that we would expect, perhaps, of the ghostly, but it shows that Anne is still writing in a Gothic register. It's just pivoted. So what do I mean by that? Well, the source of the Gothic horror, if you will, the source of the Gothic tension and melancholy is this idea of waiting without the possibility of contacting again those that you've loved. It's this sense of destroyed hope. It's this sense of isolation and longing and yearning unfulfilled. And that becomes more of the Gothic heart of Anne's fiction. Now, I've also mentioned that hers is an undemonic Gothic because Anne espouses a particular theological view of universalism, i.e., that nobody will be sent to hell, that everybody will be saved, or potentially that they will simply cease to be. But this idea that there is no hell, there is no sort of demonic activity as well, as becomes a correlate of that. And she critiques theologies which have this, which have a particular view of hell, but specifically she critiques Calvinism and the Calvinist doctrines of predetermination, which are that people are doubly determined, i.e., people are either destined for salvation or they are destined for damnation. It doesn't matter what they do or what they believe or who they are elect or they are unelect. And we see her critique of this in A Word to the Calvinists or A Word to the Elect from 1843, where she says, and when you, looking on your fellow men, behold them doomed to endless misery, how can you talk of joy and rapture then? May God withhold such cruel joy from me. So here again, we see that pivot. The Gothic doesn't rest in hellscapes and the demonic, but rather in ideologies and religious beliefs, which she views herself as monstrous, that those become the sort of Gothic shadows, those become the Gothic monsters, if you will. And in her critique of Calvinism, in that she is part of a longer Gothic tradition. There's a lot of works that critique Calvinism and predetermination in different ways and in different registers. Mandeville by William Godwin is about somebody who is sort of deep in religious mania as a sort of staunchly Calvinist Presbyterian. The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, which is the subject of our conference this year, is somebody who has gone past sort of high Calvinism into antinomian heresy, which is the idea that, well, if we're all elect or damned, it doesn't matter what we do. And the more you sin, the more glory unto God for his salvation of you. And then Matthew Lewis in The Monk also has this critique of predetermination, I would argue, because of the demonic nature of it that is demonstrated by the demon's interactions with Ambrosio. Now, Anne is using a different register. She doesn't include actual demons. She doesn't have the supernatural in it, but she is critiquing Calvinism and these ideas as a sort of Gothic horror. And you can see in the deathbed scenes of Arthur Huntingdon in Tenant of Wildfell Hall, this sense of the horror of the belief in damnation itself. have, I took a slide out, apologies, guys. If we don't have this kind of supernatural Gothic, where does the Gothic rest in Anne? Well, I would argue that it rests often in ideologies and in the prosaically mundane, in the human. And I want to kind of compare two Gondolian works written by Anne and Emily, both on the same day, so perhaps relating to a similar story or even the same incident. And I think they give us an insight into how Anne constructs the Gothic of the monstrously human in comparison to Emily, who is more overtly Gothic. So in Zed's dream, it starts with a man saying, I had a dream, I slept, and it was like time was peeled back and I returned to my childhood. And he talks about sort of wandering the hills gaily in both senses with a young friend, and they are so close to each other. They have a sort of a fake fight, he half in wrath, I all for love. And then they kind of make up. A smile, a laugh, and all was well. Upon my breast he leant his head, and into graver talk we fell. More serious, and yet so blessed did seem that calm communion then, that when I found it but a dream, I longed to sleep again. So he longs to go back to this prior time, but on waking, he has a realization of what has happened since this period. At first, remembrance slowly woke, surprise, regret, successive rose, that love's strong cords should thus be broke, and dearest friends turn deadliest foes. Then, like a cold, o'erwhelming flood, upon my soul it burst. This heart had thirsted for his blood, this hand allayed that thirst. These eyes had watched without a tear his dying agony. These ears unmoved had heard his prayer, this tongue had cursed him suffering there, and mocked him bitterly. This is the turn to human monstrosity and cruelty that comes through here. But what's dwelt on is not kind of the externals of that cruelty, but rather the internal horror of what he has let himself become for his cause, what he has destroyed, and this hideous choice that he's made. And what is, I think, particularly disturbing about this poem is after he's had this dream, and then he's had this realization, he builds himself back up into a state of fanaticism where he justifies the death. Repentance now were worse than vain. Time's current cannot backward run. And be the action wrong or right, it is forever done. Then reap the fruits. I've said his death should be my country's gain. If not, then I have spent my breath and spilt his blood in vain. And he builds himself up by the end of the poem to be back to a state of saying death or victory. But there's a monstrosity in his ideological position there, and also what it's done to him. And it's this internal focus on loss, on corruption of self, on this kind of horrors of fundamentalism or of fanaticism that forms the Gothic heart of this poem. Now, Emily writes about potentially quite a similar incident. We have somebody writing about a field of battle, which is described in quite gory detail. And we're then told that 80 were shot down, all veterans strong, one prisoner spared, their leader young, and he within his house was laid, wounded and weak and nearly dead. We gave him life against his will, for he entreated us to kill, and statue-like we saw his tears, and coldly fell our captain's sneers. Now, these might be completely separate incidents, but there's very clear connections between the type of incident that's being depicted with the sneering at the dying man. So our speaker goes on to say how he is left kind of watching over the dead, and he mocks him and he insults him. But the poem is written retrospectively at a long time after this, after his fanaticism has died down to some extent, and there is repentance in him already. So the blood spilt gives no pang at all, but it is my conscience haunting me, telling how oft my lips shed gall on many a thing, too weak to be even in thought my enemy. What happens next is that he sort of leaves the guy to die alone, and we get this horrifying image, really, of the callousness that has overtaken him. I left him there unwatched, alone, and eager sought the court below, where o'er a trough of chiselled stone an ice-cold well did gurgling flow. The water in its basin shed a stranger tinge of fiery red. I drank and scarcely marked the hue, my hand was dyed with crimson too. So this very bloody Gothic image of a man drinking bloody water with bloody hands. As the poem goes on, it ends with a young girl approaching him, saying, "Can I see my father?" and him spurning her. And then him receiving news that the people who have enacted this massacre essentially are going to be punished for it. For every person they killed, 5 of their people are going to die. And he finds out that his son is going to be punished. And so he begs on his knees to the dying man to save his son, at which point the dying man recounts how his own daughter was stabbed in his arms, horrific, and then goes on to say, "But I would never do that to you," and issues a pardon. So it ends with this almost reconciliation, but it's too late to repent. It's too late to do anything. The man dies. And so he takes his daughter, but that doesn't end well either. There's almost a twist in the ending where he talks about her anguished woe, that she wouldn't let it go. And eventually he just let her go, whatever that might mean. But the Gothic of Emily's writing is much more overt. It's much more visual, although I haven't put in as many of the visual parts because it's quite upsetting gore. And it's more extreme rather than this focus on the kind of internal processes of self-justification of monstrosity. And this idea of Anne's Gothic as internal is really pivotal to understanding her work, I think. Now, if we go to Anne's poetry, it offers us an insight into many of the themes which resonated in her work throughout her life and also in her novels. In Anne's work, we see the importance of the home. In this poem written in 1843 called The Consolation, she's talking about her life away as a governess and what supports and sustains her, which is basically the idea of home, the Haworth parsonage. Though bleak these woods and damp the ground, with fallen leaves so thickly strown, and cold the wind that wanders round with wild and melancholy moan, warm hands are there that clasped in mine the warmer heart will not belie, while mirth and truth and friendship shine in smiling lip and earnest eye. The ice that gathers round my heart may there be thawed, and sweetly then the joys of youth that now depart will come to cheer my soul again. Though far I roam, that thought shall be my hope, my comfort everywhere. While such a home remains to me, my heart shall never know despair. So this focus on the home is evident in much of Anne's work. 1 second. But the last 2 lines of this poem point us towards a source of the Gothic in Anne's work. It's a little bit ominous. While such a home remains to me, my heart shall never know despair. In another poem, we have an image of this home fractured, corrupted, or broken. In Domestic Peace, she says, "Why should such gloomy silence reign? And why is all the house so drear, when neither danger, sickness, pain, nor death, nor want have entered here? We are as many as we were that other night when all were gay, and full of hope and free from care. Yet is there something gone away, something whose absence leaves a void, a cheerless want in every heart. Each feels the bliss of all destroyed, and mourns the change, but each apart. The fire is burning in the grate as redly as it used to burn, but still the hearth is desolate, till mirth and love with peace return." So this idea of the home broken, the homeliness broken, if you will, and also this idea of the disruption of the home is a really kind of key source of Gothic in Anne's work, as you can probably be thinking already with the houses that we come up against in Tenant of Wildfell Hall, but I'll get back to that connection. We also have, as a sort of key theme in much of Anne's poetry, the sense of giving in and accepting reality, accepting what will never happen, what cannot happen. I find this poem quite grim. I think the end is meant to be a little bit uplifting, but it just seems very sad to me in some ways. In Self-Communion, she's talking about kind of what she wanted and what she's not going to get in life. The warmest words are all too cold, the secret transports to unfold of simplest word or softest sigh, or from the glancing of an eye to say what rapture beams. One look that bids our fears depart and well assures the trusting heart. It beats not in the world alone. Such speechless rapture I have known, but only in my dreams. Which is pretty crushing. She goes on at the end, though, to sort of rally herself, or try to, but there's something really quite dark about this rallying. "O weak of heart, why thus deplore that truth will fancy's dreams destroy? Did I not tell thee years before life was for labour, not for joy? Cease, selfish spirit, to repine, or thine own ills no longer grieve. Lo, there are sufferings worse than thine, which thou mayst labour to relieve. There's elements here that we're going to see over and over again in Anne's poetry, this kind of repression of self, this self kind of martyring as well. I think it's really interesting that we have this line, life was for labour, not for joy, that she's telling herself, which is something that, in a slight paraphrase, is said, why can I never remember his name, by the vicar in Jane Eyre to Jane Eyre when he says, you were made for labour, not for love. But this is something that Anne is saying to herself. We do get this sense, both in Anne's life and in her poetry later, of this sense of isolation and alienation that's occurring because of the self-repressions. There's another poem called Self-Congratulation, where she congratulates herself on hiding her emotions to the extent that nobody knows what's going on with her, basically, that she is hiding and pressing down all of this sorrow. And I think there is this kind of theme of how duty interacts with self-negation that runs through Anne's poetry and in the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and is one of the sources of that kind of deeply unsettling feeling in Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which I would align with the Gothic. So from Anne's poetry to her fiction, I'm going to burn through a couple more topics that appear in Anne's poetry. As I've mentioned, it's a really good indication of some of the broader themes across her work. And I'm going to show you how they appear in the poetry and how they might connect to some of her novelizations or some of her novels. Don't worry, you don't need to know the story of Tenant of Wildfell Hall to understand these things. I will pull out enough detail to make it clear what's happening or why there is this connection. So one of the elements of Anne's poetry is a focus on waiting for things to change, waiting for people to return, waiting to feel okay again, but waiting. And it turns into the Gothic in Anne's fiction when she talks about waiting without hope of reconciliation or without hope of return. And this is a theme that does come up in some of her works like Severed and Gone, when she is eternally separated from the dead. In The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, this theme of the kind of the traumas of waiting and this waiting increasingly without hope, this Gothic waiting, can be seen in Helen waiting for Arthur's return. So Helen is in a fairly abusive marriage with Arthur, who is an alcoholic. And when he goes to London, he basically dives back into the world of drink and probably womanizing as well. And he increasingly stays for longer periods in London. She waits for him. She waits on his promises to return, and he doesn't come, or he stays away longer. He comes back in a worse state, both physically and mentally. And this continual waiting she describes as being sort of more horrific than knowing. The hope is more horrific than knowing. And we'll come back to the idea of the horror of hope in a second. Nostalgia for the past is evident in much of Anne's poetry, with the necessary correlate that the present isn't great. So in her poem Past Day, she says, "'Tis strange to think there was a time when mirth was not an empty name." And this idea of the past as this period to which one cannot return appears in Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and Helen's reflections on her childhood, on her premarital state, is something that cannot be regained. Life has forever changed, and you cannot go back. You're trapped in the present. Martyrdom and self-sacrifice appear across a lot of her works. In Last Lines, we've already seen that in some of her other writing, but in Last Lines it's very clear. "Shall I with joy thy blessing share, and not endure the loss, or hope the martyr's crown to wear, and cast away the cross?" So she's using a religious language here, and she's addressing Jesus, but this idea that life is to suffer, essentially. Life is to carry the crown of, to carry the cross of duty, martyrdom, and self-sacrifice. We see this in an interesting way in the song from 1845, which is a Gondal poem, where she says, "I would rather be the hare than be the hunter's hound," or she has her character say that, the sense of wanting to negate or erase the self in order not to become the predator, the person who harms. In terms of martyrdom and self-sacrifice, we can see that in Tenant of Wildfell Hall very clearly in the fact that Helen returns to Arthur after she's escaped from him because he's dying, and she goes to look after him. This is also connected to duty, which is a constant theme across Anne's work. What is due? What is your duty to do? In The Narrow Way, she says, "To labour and to love, to pardon and endure, to lift thy heart to God above, and keep thy conscience pure are the duties." of a woman, or you can very easily see this as the duties of a Gothic heroine, because this is exactly what early Gothic heroines have to do. Conscience and untenable decisions is a really key part of Anne's internal Gothic and in her work more broadly, where she wrestles with often the divide between duty, or what your cause demands of you, and what your heart demands of you, or two sort of dividing things of the head, if you will. So in Zed's dream, we have, as we've seen, somebody killing a childhood friend in war. So he's divided between his childhood affections and his love of somebody, and what the cause demands of him, or what he makes it demand of him. In Song 2, which is also from the Gondal world, Come to the Banquet, we have this idea of victory in the cause being outweighed or weighed in the scale against the loss of a conscience undefiled. This idea that difficult decisions can be a sort of zero sum, that nobody wins, or nothing is you are not capable of winning that decision. There is no good decision to be made. In Tenant of Wildfell Hall, Helen faces a number of similar untenable decisions. And she is not really choosing between the head and the heart. She's choosing between different forms of duty. In leaving Arthur, she doesn't really consider herself. Instead, she considers what is due to her husband against what is due to her son, and chooses what is due to her son, who is being corrupted by his father. Similarly, when she returns, she chooses between her duty to her husband and her duty to herself, and chooses her husband. Religious melancholy is another sort of consistent aspect in Anne's work that threads through and can be a source of horror in some cases. Horror is perhaps too strong a word, but a source of sort of disquiet. She was influenced by the work of the poet William Cowper, and also she writes a poem to him. Cowper believed that he was not one of the elect, and lived with the sort of horror of that belief for much of his life. And she writes to him to say that, no, you can't be damned, basically. So she disagrees with his point of view. But this idea of how the horror of believing yourself to be damned does come through in the Tenant of Wildfell Hall and the deathbed scenes of Arthur. We also have this sense of the struggles of faith. In My God, though, let me call thee mine. She says, I cannot say my faith is strong. I dare not hope my love is great, but strength and love to thee belong. Oh, do not leave me desolate. Anybody who's struggled with doubt or loss of faith will know kind of how traumatic those experiences can be when you're going through that process. Another figure that appears in her poetry, who's very relevant to her later work, is the reformed penitent. So in The Penitent, it's somebody who is penitent, but is not being encouraged by those around them. And she says, hold on thy course, nor deem it strange that earthly cords are riven. Man may lament the wondrous change, but there is joy in heaven. I'm referencing the Bible verse, there is joy in heaven over one sinner saved. But this idea of the reformed penitent is very evident in Tenant of Wildfell Hall and the character of Lord Loughborough, who's one of Arthur's friends, one of his raucous drinking friends. But Lord Loughborough decides to leave that life behind, and it's very difficult for him, and his friends try and drag him back into drinking. He actually ends up taking opium in order to stop his alcohol addiction, which of course is not a great change of direction. Most importantly, perhaps, and a really major theme in Anne's thinking and towards the end of her life, is the idea of the sinner and sin-degraded misery, the anguish that defies relief as a form of horror. What sin does to you, essentially. And you can see this, there's obviously a religious vocabulary here, but it's also a very humane look at life that she's giving. She's not judging somebody based on, oh, this is something I think is wrong, so I think it is inherently degrading to you. Rather, she's looking at behaviors which make people become something that they would not have wished to be at another date in their life. And she's particularly interacting with Bramwell's decline, his alcoholism and addictions, and the ways in which those changed his personality and his behaviors. And we also have a sort of view from the other side as well, the person who looks on the sinner, or the person who is in decline and cannot help them. So grieving to look on vice and sin, yet powerless to quell the silent current from within and the outward torrent swell, while all the good I would impart, the feelings I would share, are driven backward to my heart and turned to wormwood there. So this idea of the Gothic horror of degradation, moral, spiritual, and physical is a key theme in the Tenant of Wildfell Hall. We see it early on when Arthur has been in London and Helen says to him, she cries and he says, "I'm crying for you, Arthur." I replied, speedily drying my tears and starting up. I threw myself on my knees before him, clasping his nerveless hand between my own, continued, "Don't you know that you're part of myself? And do you think you can injure and degrade yourself and I not feel it?" "Degrade myself, Helen?" "Yes, degrade. What have you been doing all this time?" "You better not ask," said he with a faint smile. "And you had better not tell, but you cannot deny that you have degraded yourself miserably. You have shamefully wronged yourself, body and soul, and me too. And I can't endure it quietly, and I won't." So there's certainly an element of judgment here, but there's also the sort of idea of somebody on the outside of somebody in a self-destructive spiral and unable to reach them. And she uses this kind of religious language or understanding to kind of think of it as a degradation, a spiritual degradation as much as anything else, but also in the book, a very clear physical degradation. This all eventually comes to a head when Arthur is dying and he's on his deathbed, racked with kind of the horrors of impending death and potentially impending doom. And he becomes completely dependent on Helen. And these scenes they're really graphically drawn, they're really upsetting, and they are obviously as well influenced by real life. Another sort of key theme that I wanted to draw out, and the title of the talk, is the idea of the horror of hope. So Anne's work is not without hope, but she does kind of go back to this idea of false hope, deceiving hope, and horrifying hope, making everything worse, essentially. So the horror of a fruitless hope. In The Parting, a poem from the Gondal world, you have a character saying, "Well, my husband left and he never came back, and I just wish I knew what happened to him. I wish I knew the worst," she said. "I wish I could despair. These fruitless hopes and this constant dread are more than I can bear." And this idea of fruitless hope is seen in Helen's hopeless hopes in the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, particularly when Arthur is away and she's waiting for him to come back. And she wants to believe the promises that he's given. She wants to believe the things that he's saying. But every time when he comes back, it gets worse. And all the hopes that she had for her future, all the hopes that she had for her life are slowly kind of cut down and cut away from her. And she becomes trapped in this endless present, unable to go back to a past that she loved, unable to escape, trapped by duty as much as anything else, forced to control her emotions, forced to sort of minimize herself into this kind of cold little box in order to survive. Through Anne's work, you have this idea of reality and hope often being juxtaposed. In Views of Life, you have her saying, "I too have smiled and thought like you, but madly smiled and falsely deemed. Truth led me to the present view. I'm waking now, and 'twas then I dreamed." So this sense of kind of the hopes that you have being, something that leads you astray. And she goes on in that poem to say, "Then I knew that hope was all a dream, but thus fond youth she cheated me, and she will prove as false to thee." In the novel, we also have the weaponization of hope, which is even more horrifying. Helen, she says, "I had no earthly hope but this." And the hope that she has is the ability to raise her son and be in a loving relationship with him. But his father is teaching the son to hate her. He's getting his son drunk. He's teaching him to curse her out. He's teaching him to be cruel to animals. It's all really, really upsetting stuff. And she says, "I had no earthly hope but this." And he seems to take a diabolical delight in tearing it away. So hope here not only betrays you, but makes you open to being made into to being victimized, essentially. So I've mentioned the Tenant of Wildfell Hall a little bit. For those of you who don't know, let me give you an overview of what it is. We have an epistolary framing with an initial male narrator who I haven't mentioned thus far, called Gilbert Markham. Now, Gilbert Markham is writing a letter to a good friend of his where he just reveals all of his love story, and he sends this friend his wife's diaries, just, as you do. I was mentioning this morning, it's an interesting framing because we do have Helen's voice in the middle in the diaries, but from the present day, we don't have Helen's voice. And so the narrative is relatively controlled by Gilbert Markham in the end. But Gilbert is a local farmer, and a mysterious widow has moved into Wildfell Hall with a young son, and she kind of keeps herself apart from people. She's only friends with the owner of the house who doesn't live there. And Gilbert starts to suspect, as his love for her grows, that this owner of the house is actually having an affair with her, to the extent that, he attacks him in this really brutal attack on the side of the road, where he hits him with his metal top cane and then leaves him by the side of the road. It's really, really grim. And at this point, he also has this confrontation with her where she explains that she is, in fact, already married. She's still married. And then she gives him the diaries to look over. He goes to his room, reads them, and we get all of the backstory of Helen. And we find out about her early marriage to Arthur Huntingdon. She'd been a young woman full of hopes, and also full of the thought that she could redeem this man, that there was a seed of goodness in him that she could draw out. Very Rochester, if you will. But a lot more realistic. Anne is a lot more realistic about how those relationships work out, because of course she doesn't reform him. He begins to find her boring, and their relationship continues to get worse and worse, and he slips further and further into alcoholism. There's a number of other characters that act as kind of alternate paths in a way. So Lord Loughborough and Mr. Hattersley are both friends of Arthur, both big drinkers in the same way, but their paths end somewhat differently. Lord Loughborough is the one who repents and tries to stop drinking. He marries an Annabella Wilmot, who he is deeply in love with, but unfortunately for him, she has an affair with Arthur, which is also, of course, unfortunate for Helen. Lord Loughborough does get a happy ending in the end, guys, but we see this kind of path of the penitent being played out in him. We also have Mr. Hattersley, who marries Helen's friend, Millicent Hargrave, and treats her very poorly during the beginning of their marriage, although comes to appreciate her later on after a stern talking to from Helen. We also have Walter Hargrave, Millicent's brother, who tries to start an affair with Helen. And Helen is basically trapped in this luxurious house with this man who is abusive and sometimes violent, certainly psychologically violent. He also brings his friends there who are drinking and can get argumentative and violent while they're there. And we see this kind of, she feels like he is degrading himself, but also we see her quality of life going down. We see her very much trapped within this situation. At the end, Gilbert Markham reads all of this, reads the story, he's like, oh my God, I made a terrible mistake. I'm so sorry. Goes to find her and finds that she's gone because she received word that her husband was dying, and she goes back to look after him. He does eventually die after a long and protracted deathbed. And then she inherits a lot of money and she's very rich. And then Gilbert has a whole kind of, oh no, I can't approach her anymore because she's so rich. And then they get married. I personally think that was a terrible mistake. But, you can read that how you will. So the other part of the title for this talk was the horrors of hope and the darkness of the everyday. And one of the things that I want to draw out now is the way in which Anne's Gothic is very everyday. It's rooted in the prosaic. It's rooted in things that are real, that actually happen. But it's also rooted in her experiences, particularly with her brother Bramwell. And his last months, last years, and his illness, both his alcoholism and its results. And he also sort of died in a very distressing way, which sort of has inspired Arthur Huntingdon's decline and death. Charlotte tells us of this inspiration in a letter to her publisher Williams in 1850, when they're talking about whether Wildfell Hall should be republished. And Charlotte's basically like, no. I mentioned before that Charlotte very much is like, Emily wrote beautiful things and also wrote things, and she can be really dismissive of Anne. So Wildfell Hall, it hardly appears to me desirable to preserve, is what she says. The choice of subject in that work is a mistake. It was too little consonant with the character, tastes, and ideas of the gentle, retiring, and inexperienced writer. She wrote it under a strange, conscientious, half ascetic notion of accomplishing a painful penance and a severe duty. Blameless in deed and almost in thought, there was from her very childhood a tinge of religious melancholy in her mind. Here we have drawn out some of those themes I've already mentioned, ideas of duty and martyrdom. But what was this duty that Anne perceived herself to have? Well, she tells us herself in the preface to the second edition, where she's responding to critics who are critiquing the content here, saying that this is not sort of suitable content for polite society. She says, when we have to do with vice and vicious characters, I maintain it is better to depict them as they really are than as they would wish to appear. To present a bad thing in its least offensive light is doubtless the most agreeable course for a writer of fiction to pursue. But is it the most honest or the safest? Is it better to reveal the snares and pitfalls of life to the young and thoughtless traveller, or to cover them with branches and flowers? So Anne views herself as writing both for women and men, writing to young women who are entering into marriage thinking they can reform men like this, and basically saying you can't. But she's also writing to young men, revealing what the consequences of this kind of drinking culture and stepping away or stepping into vice, stepping away from the social mores, so hard, if you will, what the result of that can be. And she's very traumatized, I think, by Branwell's death and decline. And that is what she is wanting to warn people from. Doesn't want to happen to anybody else. There's also another potential source of inspiration for the novel, which would have been accessed by Charlotte. So we have, by Anne, sorry. We have this letter from Charlotte to Ellen Nussey, which mentions a Mr. Collins and a Mrs. Collins, where Charlotte says, do you remember my telling you, or did I ever tell you about that wretched and most criminal Mr. Collins? After running an infamous career of vice both in England and France, abandoning his wife to disease and total destitution in Manchester, with 2 children and without a farthing in a strange lodging house. I could almost have cried to see her, for I had pitied her with my whole soul when I heard of her undeserved sufferings, agonies, and physical degradation. She took tea with us, stayed about 2 hours, and entered frankly into the narrative of her appalling distresses. Her constitution has triumphed over the hideous disease, and her excellent sense, her activity and perseverance have enabled her to regain a decent position in society and to procure a respectable maintenance for herself and her children. And this idea of a woman surviving an abusive and terrible marriage and making her own way in the world as well may well have influenced Anne's writing of Helen, who goes to Wildfell Hall and takes on a career as an artist, in her case, to support herself. Now, the question I most often get asked when I'm doing classes on Tenant of Wildfell Hall is it actually Gothic though, Sam? I think it is. I hopefully have shown you some of the themes that lean towards the Gothic that are drawn out in Tenant of Wildfell Hall. But I also want to point to the way in which it's part of a longer standing female tradition, in which the real source of danger are fathers and husbands, the men trying to steal their property and curtail their freedom. So the real source of danger aren't the ghosts in the castle, it's the men. I also want to suggest that she's in this sort of tradition of what is often referred to as female Gothic, and she draws from both the Gothic heroine and villain of these earlier works. So the Gothic heroine of novels like Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, his heroine is called Emily, are marked by sensibility and fine emotion, by piety, and also by endurance. That is how they survive most of the things that they survive. And Helen certainly borrows from this image of the Gothic heroine, particularly while she is still in her marriage. However, she becomes more active, taking that decision to leave herself and facilitating it herself. I also would argue that she takes a little from the Gothic villain, but rewrites her. So in a lot of early Gothic novels, there's usually a villainous woman. I've put the example here of Victoria in Charlotte Dacre's The Floyer or the Moor, who starts with promiscuity and ends up with rape, murder, poisoning, death, all of this sort of moral decline. But more broadly, in these early novels, for example, the character of Loredani in The Mysteries of Udolpho, you see a woman who has stepped outside of the patriarchal boundaries and conditions of behavior. Often she will have disrupted a marriage, and her actions are seen as sort of part of a slippery slope into ultimate moral decline. But what I think happens in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is we take this woman who has disrupted the bonds of matrimony, has made a decision against the social mores of the day, and who is justified for it. So there is a sort of flipping of the early Gothic narrative to some extent. I'd also position Anne in relation to a wider history of political Gothic. in novels like Caleb Williams' William Godwin, which takes on the iniquities of the criminal justice system, or The English Nun by Catherine Selden, which looks at arguments around theopolitical toleration at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, where we're looking at the removal of the Discriminatory Tests and Corporations Acts or the Catholic Emancipation Act. Also, most obviously, there's a connection with texts like Mary Wollstonecraft's Maria or the Wrongs of Woman, which use the Gothic vocabulary in order to reveal the real difficulties and challenges facing women. So Mary Wollstonecraft's beginning to her story quite famously sort of takes this Gothic register. Abodes of horror have frequently been described, castles filled with spectres and chimeras, conjured up by the magic spell of genius to harrow the soul and absorb the wandering mind. But formed of such stuff as dreams are made of, what were they to the mansion of despair in one corner of which Maria sat, endeavouring to recall her scattered thoughts? Maria here is in an asylum. But there is this sort of movement going on between, this is sort of the external trappings of Gothic horror, but the real horror looks different. And I think we see that to some extent in Anne Brontë. And that ties in with another form of early Gothic, the Gothic parody, most famously in Northanger Abbey. But not all of these books are simple parody, and Northanger Abbey isn't simple parody either. It uses parody to unveil a more prosaically Gothic world. So if you've heard me talk about this, you'll have heard me say a very similar thing multiple times. I apologize, but it keeps being true. So in Northanger Abbey, you have Catherine, who views the world through her reading of Gothic novels, and she makes a number of mistakes, misunderstanding people's motives or actions. But we're not left at the end of the novel with her love interest, Henry Fielding's dismissive view of her, where he says, you know, Catherine, such things don't actually happen in England. You've let your imagination run away with you. Instead, what we're left with is actually this affirmation of Catherine's instincts. Her Gothic lens has allowed her to see that prosaically Gothic reality. General Tilney might not have murdered his wife, but he did neglect her. He did psychologically abuse her. Catherine, at any rate, heard enough to feel that in suspecting General Tilney of either murdering or shutting up his wife, she had scarcely sinned against his character or magnified his cruelty. This idea of a Gothic parody, which peels away Gothic excess to reveal a Gothic reality underneath, is, I think, a technique that is used by Anne in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. And I want to give you two examples of this. The first is what I'm calling the spectre at the feast. This is Lord Loughborough, who is giving up alcohol at this point, and he's at a party with his friend. This is Arthur Huntingdon retelling this story. And he says that Loughborough continued to look in upon us pretty regularly of an evening, still abstaining with wonderful perseverance from the rank poison he had so bravely forsworn. But some of our members protested against this conduct. They did not like to have him sitting there like a skeleton at a feast instead of contributing his quota to the general amusement, casting a cloud over all and watching with greedy eyes every drop they carried to their lips. One night, however, during one of our orgies, one of our high festivals, he glided in like the ghost of Macbeth and seated himself as usual a little back from the table in the chair we always placed for the spectre, whether it chose to fill it or not. I saw by his face that he was suffering from the effects of his insidious comforter, i.e. opium, but nobody spoke to him and he spoke to nobody. A few sidelong glances and a whispered observation that the ghost was come was all the notice he drew by his appearance. Now, of course, this draws from Shakespeare and Banquo's ghost sitting over the feast, but also a more broadly Gothic register of skeletons and ghosts. But Loughborough isn't the horror here. What is the horror is his group of friends then go on to pressure him into drinking again. And not only don't support him, but drag him back into a life that he is trying to escape. And it's this casual, fashionable cruelty that becomes the real Gothic spectre at the feast. Another similar kind of double movement we see in the description of Wildfell Hall. Now, this is a long description. Do feel free to screenshot it and read it in your own time. But I'll just pull out the bit at the end. It's described in quite a Gothic way. It's isolated, it's cold and gloomy, thick stone mullions and little latticed panes. It's also surrounded by a Gothic landscape half blighted with storms, surrounded by hills and desolate fields. And it's also surrounded by this rundown garden. The close green walls of privet that had bordered the principal walk were 2/3 withered away, and the rest grown beyond all reasonable bounds. The old boxwood swan that sat beside the scraper had lost its neck and half its body. The castellated towers of laurel in the middle of the garden, the gigantic warrior that stood on one side of the gateway, and the lion that guarded the other were sprouted into such fantastic shapes as resembled nothing, either in heaven or earth, or in the waters under the earth. But to my young imagination, they presented all of them a goblinish appearance that harmonized well with the ghostly legions and dark traditions our old nurse had told us respecting the haunted hall and its departed occupants. So Wildfell appears to us as a aesthetically very Gothic location, potentially haunted as well. But this is not the Gothic home. This for Helen is a place of refuge and safety away from the horrors of her former life. Instead, it is the luxurious dwelling that she shared with her husband that is the truly Gothic location. In this way, Anne is engaging with another form of the Gothic that was particularly prevalent in the Victorian period, the domestic Gothic. Tamara Wagner notes that in Victorian Britain, the Gothic lent itself to new types of writing, a move away from the early Gothic of Radcliffe and Lewis, and it lent itself as a means of exploring new challenges and threats, to articulate anxieties about modernity, new technologies, the results of rampant industrialization, and to new awareness of mental illness, crime, and the anonymity of expanding urban spaces. Depicting a Gothic home offered a strategy either to reaffirm or to puncture the idea of a domestic shelter from all these threats. So, in other words, in Gothic tales and novels of the period, the home can be a place of safety, or more increasingly, a place of threat, the place that encloses and entraps you. And it's this idea of the enclosing and entrapping Gothic home that appears in the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, in the home that Helen shares with her husband. In this way, it performs a similar function as the Gothic halls of Wuthering Heights, which give the lie on various grounds to the Victorians' idealized view of domesticity, that was perhaps best captured in John Ruskin's famous essay of Queen's Gardens as the place of peace, the shelter not only from all injury, but from all terror, doubt, and division. In the process, middle-class identity, domestic and romantic ideals, and the institutions that grant them authority and protection are exposed and interrogated. So the Gothic home that we find in the Tenant of Wildfell Hall does pose a challenge to ideas of middle-class identity and domestic and romantic ideals. It challenges the idea of marriage as women's ultimate goal or a place of safety and even veneration. It also exposes the institutions that grant marriage and the sort of the state of women more broadly. It challenges their authority and protection. They're exposed and interrogated through this critique of an individual situation. Now, whether Anne was really going for that larger critique is debatable, and the extent of her sort of feminist rebellion is debatable, but it's certainly what occurs through the novel, that by using this close focus on a single case, a single woman's relationship, it points to the cracks in the existing marriage laws and the existing kind of position of women. I just wanted to draw you in here to note this as a recurring theme across all of the Bronte sisters' work, this idea of the horrifying house, and it not always being the one that you expect it to be. So this is just a question for you. Feel free to answer in the chat, or feel free not to answer at all. But we come across lots of different houses in the sort of the three key works that I've mentioned here: Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, and the Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Grassdale, the home that Helen shares with her husband. Wildfell Hall. In Jane Eyre, we have Thornfield, where Mr. Rochester lives, Gateshead, where Jane was brought up. And then in Wuthering Heights, we have Wuthering Heights itself, or Thrushcross Grange, all of which arguably are Gothic houses in different ways, showcasing different forms of Gothic horror and entrapment. Which for you is the worst of these houses? Now, I want to end with this consideration of Anne's writing as a potential form of the feminist Gothic. There's a lot of claims for Anne's writing as unambiguously feminist. One of the most famous is that by May Sinclair, who was an author herself. Very much recommend her work at the beginning of the 20th century. She states very boldly that Anne Bronte as an exponent of women's rights, her right to her place in the sun, her right to love, her right to express her love, at any rate in literature, as she sees fit. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall cries aloud. There is no submission about it. It is in open and would-be violent revolt. Anne Bronte is up against all the Victorian dogmas and traditions, against eternal punishment, against St. Paul, against the woman's vow of obedience in holy matrimony. She is really, though she would have died rather than have owned it, up against the marriage laws. Anne Bronte attacks her problem with a freedom and audacity before which her sister's boldest enterprises seemed cowardly and restrained. When she slammed the door of Mrs. Huntingdon's bedroom, she slammed it in the face of society and all existing moralities and conventions. I think this connection to the work of Charlotte and Emily is really interesting because they are more obviously engaged in debates around women's rights for some people, or it's often brought up in scholarly criticism and discussions of the work of Charlotte and Emily. But I agree with May Sinclair here that what Anne does is essentially more radical. Whereas in Jane Eyre, for example, and in Wuthering Heights, a lot of the resistance is internal. It's the key characters inveighing against the world that entraps them, but still ultimately working within it and ending up often with a marriage that doesn't actually disrupt much of anything, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your view, I guess, but doesn't end up with an external resistance, whereas Anne's very prosaically does in much more radical ways. She doesn't have the same internality, and Helen doesn't have this same kind of desire for freedom, this same questioning of woman's place in society. She takes her own situation and she uses her moral and religious feelings to adjudicate it. But in doing so, she makes these bold statements. It is a woman's right to leave her husband if it is better to do so for her children in the case of the book. And so there is a radicalism that is almost, it's not that it's unintentional, but it's not connected in the same way to this wider questioning of women's positions, in a sort of radical questioning of women's positions. But there is a radicalism to Anne. And I think this also comes out in the way that Anne talks about her own writing. She takes up in the preface to the second edition, she's already challenged people saying that she shouldn't write about this kind of content. And she also addresses those people who are speculating over her identity and her gender. She says, as to whether the name be real or fictitious, it cannot greatly signify to those who know him only by his works. As little, I should think, can it matter whether the writer so designated is a man or a woman, as one or two of my critics profess to have discovered. I take the imputation in good part as a compliment to the just delineation of my female characters, and though I am bound to attribute much of the severity of my censors to this suspicion, I make no effort to refute it, because in my own mind I am satisfied that if a book is a good one, it is so whatever the sex of the author may be. All novels are, or should be, written for both men and women to read, and I'm at a loss to conceive how a man should permit himself to write anything that would really be disgraceful to a woman, or why a woman should be censured for writing anything that would be proper and becoming for a man. So she takes the fight to them, very much so, but she's also making a fairly radical statement about the equality of men and women as writers and in terms of what they are allowed to interact with in the public sphere. Now, to go back to that May Sinclair quote and this idea of the shutting door, there are two kind of main parts of the story of Helen where we have this shutting door motif. And I want to draw them out and want to draw out a little bit what the implications are of both scenes. In this one, Helen has just found out that Arthur has been having an affair, and she asks him if she can go. Will you let me take our child and what remains of my fortune and go? Go where? Well, anywhere where we will be safe from your contaminating influence, and I shall be delivered from your presence and you from mine. No. Will you let me have my child then without the money? No, nor yourself without the child. Do you think I'm going to be made the talk of the country for your fastidious caprices? Then I must stay here, to be hated and despised. But henceforth we are husband and wife only in name. Very good. I am your child's mother and your housekeeper, nothing more. So you need not trouble yourself any longer to feign the love you cannot feel. I will exact no more heartless caresses from you, nor offer nor endure them either. I will not be mocked with the empty husk of conjugal endearments when you have given the substance to another. So here she is essentially refusing to have any sexual contact with them in the future. And this is radical for the time. This is her shutting the bedroom door. And this is her asserting her autonomy over her own body, which was very far from being enshrined in law, of course, at the time. The other closing the door is when she finally leaves. This is the evening before she's going to make her escape. And she's at dinner with him, and he says, "What's to do with you now?" said he, when the removal of the second course gave him time to look about him. "I'm not well," I replied. "I think I must lie down a little. You won't miss me much." "Not the least. If you leave your chair, it'll do just as well." "Better a trifle," he muttered as I left the room, "for I can fancy somebody else fills it." "Somebody else may fill it tomorrow," I thought, but did not say. "There, I've seen the last of you, I hope," I muttered as I closed the door upon him. Here, this is the closing door, which indicates her leaving this marriage, her breaking through the marriage laws and the idea of obedience, and her choosing for herself, not relying on the law to say what is a good point or a right point for her to leave her marriage. So, if we're going to think about Anne Bronte's writing as a form of feminist Gothic in some ways, I think we need to shift our expectations of what that means. If we're thinking about feminism, Anne is not engaged in all of the questions of proto-feminism which were being debated at the time. A lot of her motivation is not based on the intrinsic right of women to self-determination, but instead on the idea of what a woman's religious duties are. In the case of Helen, she leaves, as I've mentioned before, because she sees the threat to her son's spiritual and moral well-being and believes it to be her duty to leave the house. Otherwise, she may well have stayed with her husband, believing it her duty to reform him. So we need to approach the sort of proto-feminism of Anne Bronte's work with some considerable nuance and relate to it as a text of its period and take into account the ways in which Anne's religious and moral viewpoints are impacting what she's writing. In terms of whether it's Gothic, again, we need to reset our assumptions a little bit about what the Gothic is and how it manifests. We're moving away from the overtly Gothic motifs of the supernatural, but also of the kind of more Gothic aesthetic that we might find in Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights necessarily. Anne Bronte's Gothic is far more internal, and it relies on an emotional Gothic landscape as much as anything else. It's also interesting to see the roots of the Gothic that appear within it, this idea of the failure of hope, of a domestic entrapment, but also the particular horrors of Arthur's situation for much of the Gothic core, the moral, spiritual, and physical degradation, and his horrific deathbed scene, as well as the corruption of his small son, become the Gothic heart of the text. So I hope that I've given you sort of some reasons or some new ways of interacting with Anne, and I'm very excited about any questions and comments that people have. Thanks for joining me, everyone.